Hey folks, I'm Alex Dowd.
And I'm Katie Rife.
Today in the show, we're going to be talking about movie theaters, some of our favorite experiences, a little bit of the history of them, and why we're so nostalgic for that right now.
Remember movie theaters? Welcome to Film Club.
So, Katie, we're about, about a month now into social distancing?
About a month.
Yep.
Maybe a little more. If you went in early, good job. And you're a little over a month if you went in early. You're about a month and a few days.
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel like the weekend of March 9th was when all this really began. Mm-hmm. It's a strange time in general. Our relationship to time is very strange right now, I feel like.
Yeah, I have some days where it feels relatively normal. And for example, yesterday, I feel like I looked up and it was 12:30, and then I looked up again and it was 7:30 at night. I don't know what happened.
I've been experiencing some of that myself too. I mean, there's just no change in your environment, really. You know, you're just in the same place. Obviously, everyone is missing a lot of different experiences that they have in the world. For cinephiles, I think a big part of that is movie theaters.
Yeah.
Movie theaters have been closed since around the time everyone started social distancing. Some theaters were sort of immediately closed their doors due to a lack of. I mean, the first thing that happened was distributors were actually pulling releases and postponing them, so movie theaters were suddenly faced with what are we actually going to show? And then a lot of places in America have put stay-at-home orders in. They've basically said non-essential businesses must close. And what that means is that I kind of doubt there's a movie theater open in America right now.
If there is, it's in deep Mississippi. The governor of that state has been very vocally opposed to statewide orders.
Yeah, also in deep violation of what we should be doing.
Yeah. We won't dwell too much on politics, but there were some churches that insisted on having services for Easter, and now they are seeing some infections. Those churches turned out to be infection locuses. So,
in any case, movie theaters not open, and I think it's starting to get to some people. I know that I'm already missing the movie theaters as an experience. This week, we saw a couple of op-eds go up.
Yep.
Rather coincidentally, both about missing movie theaters and about what it's been like without them. Last week on Twitter, a particular clip was making the round from last year. It was opening night audiences reacting to the big climax of Avengers Endgame when certain things happen, and we won't spoil that, but
reacting is a mild word. They are losing their minds. They're going nuts.
Actually, yeah, let's play that clip. I want people to hear that.
Oh my God!
It's hard to not hear that and feel a little bit of, regardless of what you feel about Marvel movies and regardless of what you feel about whatever that was paying off. And I can imagine even somebody going to that and feeling annoyed to be in that theater during that moment. But now, I don't know. I mean, I hear that and it makes me awfully nostalgic for being in a movie theater with a bunch of people watching a film.
Yeah, this is the longest you mentioned before the show you've gone without being in a movie theater since childhood?
Probably childhood. Probably since, I started going to the movies regularly as a teenager. I was, I feel like the summer of 1997 was when I became like, this is now a thing I do every week.
Sure, this is my thing. This is what I do.
This is me now. Yeah. This is who I am. And probably since then, I don't think I've gone more than a couple weeks without getting out to a movie theater. So this is definitely, I'm going through a little bit of withdrawal. For me, a movie theater is not just about the immersiveness of the sound and picture, although, of course, I do think on that level, it remains the best place to watch a movie in terms of the actual technical experience, the technological experience of seeing a movie. I think movie theaters are still, setting aside theaters that have projection problems or something, I do think that is the best place to watch a movie.
And there is actually a psychological benefit to watching films in a theater as opposed to on a screen at home. The blue light that emanates from phones and from TV screens, it's beaming directly into your eyes. And that psychologically does shut down your brain a little bit. It gives you sort of a deer in the headlights effect if you look at it long enough. But in a movie theater, you're not looking directly into the light of the projector. You're watching the shadows from the light coming out of the projector on a wall. So psychologically, your brain processes watching a film in a theater differently than it processes watching a film on TV.
That's very interesting. I don't know if I knew that, actually. It makes a lot of sense. For me, it's also about time, though, and it's about your relationship to the thing that's on screen. The thing about it is that in a movie theater, you do not have the capacity to pause. If you can go to the bathroom, but you're going to miss something in the movie. When you sit down in a theater, it's basically you creating a contract between yourself and the movie that's happening on screen. You say, for this 90 minutes, for this 2 hours, for this 3 hours, whatever, it's me in this movie. And I think we'll talk at some point about some of why some people actually don't love it anymore. And I think part of that, though, is people being on their phones. But in an ideal situation, all their distractions are gone. This thing is just filling your field of vision. It's you in this movie. It is kind of like a cathedral. It's for me, it's probably as close to a religious experience as if I could be a little hyperbolic about it.
Well, sure, especially when you go into a theater like the Music Box in Chicago, which is an old-fashioned movie palace. It's built up, it's decorated like a cathedral.
It is. It very much is. And just during that period of time, there you do not have the option to stop the movie, or there are less distractions. Because most movies, Quibi aside, most movies are designed to be watched. At least in conception, you watch them in one sitting. Basically,
right.
That is 90. It's a 90-minute unbroken piece of art that you experience, and I think movie theaters preserve that aspect of the experience. They say, "Well, you're here. This is what you're doing."
Yeah, and I think time does move differently in a movie theater than it does watching a film at home. There are films that I saw for the first time in the theater and watched them the second time at home, and just the duration of the film felt different watching it outside of that sort of hallowed environment that you were talking about.
For sure.
Well, and it's funny that you mentioned people being on their phones is kind of ruining the experience. That is a pretty common complaint as to why people say that, people are so much ruder at the movies now. But actually, in some ways, the movie-going experience is more structured than it used to be. Originally, movie exhibition, after the initial days of the Nickelodeons, it was based on a vaudeville model, and it was standard for a movie showing to start with a live act, and then you have shorts, comedic or dramatic serials, and then you'd have a newsreel, and then you show the film. And that kind of fell apart with the advent both of sound and of the Great Depression in the 30s, and that brought about the double feature, which was initially offered as sort of a incentive to get people to go to movies, more value for your money in a time of financial hardship. And so, you see these distinct eras in movie going. So you had the double feature era and the studio system era where you had A pictures and B pictures. And that kind of broke up, not to get too deep in the weeds, but that kind of broke up in the late 40s with a famous, if you don't know anything about the Paramount Supreme Court decision, it's very interesting to read about because it broke up movie theater monopolies. Movie theaters used to own theaters as well. And so theaters just bought whatever the studio that owned the place would give them. They didn't really have a choice in what they booked. Right. And that all changed in the 50s. And so you started getting into this model that it's very different from what we have today. Movies, theaters, it was culturally acceptable to just show up whenever at a movie theater because they would show the same movie all day back to back. And you just came in, and wherever the movie was at, if you liked what you saw, you stuck around and watched the beginning afterwards. But that changed. There's other stuff going on too. There's the technological stuff with TV, but there's something very interesting is that the movie Psycho was actually a huge catalyst to change movie-going exhibition to what we know today, to where you buy a ticket for a certain time, you show up at that time, and if you don't show up on time, they don't let you in. That Alfred Hitchcock insisted on having that for Psycho, and movie theaters resisted it because they thought that no one would no one would show up. They thought that people would resent being told what time to show up at the theater, but people actually really went for it. And he insisted on the timed admissions because, I mean, I'm not going to spoil Psycho if you've never seen it, but it's got a huge...
The statute of limitations has probably passed on Psycho, but again, if you haven't seen it, I would recommend it, because I do think the moment that you're talking about, the moment that he's trying to preserve, is possibly the biggest surprise in the history of Hollywood movies.
Right, exactly.
And so maybe since even,
Yeah, and so Hitchcock didn't want people coming in halfway through the movie and having the surprise ruined.
Right.
So they insisted on timed admissions, and when that worked really well for Psycho, and Psycho was a big hit, theaters started saying, oh, we can start making more money by telling people they have to leave after a couple hours and buy another ticket if they want to see the movie again. Yep. Instead of just hanging out all day. So, and it wasn't an instantaneous change. It wasn't like overnight theaters switched to time admissions, but it was the catalyst. And by the time you got to the late 70s, pretty much the only theaters, a fact I like to cite is the theaters were called grindhouses because they would grind the film through the projector 24 hours a day. They would do it the old-fashioned way of just running the film all day long, and you can come and go as you pleased. But by the time you got to the late 70s, that was pretty much only going on in more disreputable theaters in inner cities, and after a time, it sort of became a sign of you could buy more there than just some popcorn, Like,
right.
There would be drug dealers, perhaps, or sex workers at the theater, and so it's interesting. One of the things that drives people crazy now, and they're like, oh, people now are so rude. They just wander into the theater, whenever, and just talk and aren't really paying attention to the movie. That was pretty standard. In like the 40s or the 50s, any movie you went to go see had people wandering in and out at all times.
Yeah, I sort of wonder when the idea of this etiquette that you and I surely adhere to, I feel like a lot of serious moviegoers think of as like the code of conduct in a movie theater. I do kind of wonder when that became standard. And
I would imagine around the time when, time tickets became standard, probably like the 70s, the 70s or the 80s. Yeah.
And, we can talk about, there are plenty of reasons why people don't like going to the movies anymore. And I think it does have to do with there are a couple things. I think one of them is the experience of watching a movie with crowds who are not behaving or adhering to that unspoken code, one might say. Actually, it's not unspoken a lot of the time. Like things like being on your phone is pretty explicitly called out before every movie in a multiplex now.
Oh,
like,
yes. Even
do
multiplexes do it. Yeah. Like the Alamo Drafthouse became famous for their very draconian policy on phones. Yeah. And I do want to clarify that I think that phones have made it worse.
Yeah.
I do. I think that the smartphones created a whole new kind of irritation at the movies that is bad, because when the lights go down and someone's on their phone the whole time, I was talking about the projected image versus the image being beamed directly into your eyes. Well, having the light of someone's phone right there is incredibly distracting, even if they're not talking. The light from the phone is incredibly distracting.
For sure, and unfortunately, that has become kind of, if there's a whole group of people like you and I who would never dream of taking our phone out during a movie, there's also a whole group of people who go to the movies and now think of having your phone out as, sure, why not? Why wouldn't I do that?
Yeah, I paid to be here. Yeah.
Right, and I do think that movie theaters have slightly blurred that line a little bit too, because there are, maybe it's not the theaters so much as movie studios themselves recognizing that people live on their phones now, but there's a lot of, you'll see like if you go to a movie, sometimes you'll see like the advertisements will say basically we go to a lot of advanced screenings here in Chicago as critics, and a lot of the time the image that they'll throw up on the screen before the movie is like, use this hashtag to tweet about this movie, And it's like encouraging people to use their phone. And I think they would probably argue, well, you do that after the movie, but you're blurring those lines a little bit when you're saying, don't use your phone during the movie. However, please use your phone to promote us.
Yeah, no, it's definitely something that it's implied that you're supposed to do it after the movie. But in terms of public behavior, as we're finding out with all these social distancing guidelines, a lot of times with human beings, you have to say explicitly, no, you absolutely cannot do that.
For sure.
People will do it.
Yeah. The other thing, too, is that, and this is something that I've noticed, is that some movie theaters, multiplexes in particular, will not play the film as brightly as they should. Mm-hmm. They're actually tampering with the bulb. I would encourage, I hate to be the can I speak to your manager guy, but I would encourage, if you're seeing a movie and the image is not bright enough, there's a good chance that the theater you're seeing it in is deliberately saving money and energy by playing it less brightly than they should. Mm-hmm. I was talking earlier about how movie theaters are the optimal place to see a movie from a technical standpoint. That's only true if the theaters themselves are actually adhering to those standpoints.
My opinion, not informed, just my opinion, is that this all kind of has to do with the decline of expertise in digital projectors, replacing projectionists.
I think that's probably a big part of it, actually. Yeah. That, the job of movie projector is no longer one that, they still exist, but they exist largely in terms of an exclusive task, in terms of you're a person who is an artisan who does this for a living. Mm-hmm. I talked to somebody at True False, actually, about this, somebody who has done this before, or who does this professionally, and he will travel around the country to basically freelance project at theaters that need him to do that. And
when
usually
they have something that needs, like when they're showing something on film or something like that.
It's often celluloid, It's often celluloid.
Yeah.
But I think Katie, I think the truth is that, and I don't speak for everyone when I say this, is that there are some irritations with the movie theater experience.
Sure.
I have some cranky problems with some of the modern practices. I really don't like I'm really not a big fan of assigned seating. I'm very old school in the sense that I feel like you should be able to sit wherever you want in the theater, and if somebody sitting near you is being a problem, you should be able to move.
You think you got to earn it, right?
Yeah, exactly. You show up if you want a good seat, you show up a little early. The other thing is that I don't love the dining experience either. I just think that's a bit of a distraction during the movie. All of these things aside, I would say that most of the best experiences I've had with movies, a lot of them have been in movie theaters. And I'm not missing it just out of a sense of nostalgia because it's something that I've done regularly my whole life. I'm missing it because it really can be a transcendent experience to see something on the big screen.
Sure, yeah. Even if you watch a movie for the first time and you absolutely love it, but if you watch it by yourself, you're kind of left sitting there looking around like, was that really that good? Or
the communal aspect of it is something, because as much as other people in the audience can be a problem, they can also enhance the way that you experience something.
Oh, absolutely. And I actually, I know it's sort of like I was saying, with human beings, you have to draw hard lines a lot of the time in terms of behavior. People will try to find loopholes, and that's where trouble starts. But that being said, I actually kind of enjoy a little bit of controlled chaos, talking about the compact between... Sometimes there's a compact between audience members, too, particularly when you're watching less highbrow fare. Like you're watching a Friday the 13th movie, a slasher movie in the theater, or something like that. Sometimes a little bit of controlled chaos can be really, really fun.
Totally. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that, because one of my fonder movie theater experiences is actually seeing Freddy versus Jason on opening night.
Yeah, that's a perfect one for people to just scream.
Because the crowd too was it was maybe made up of people who had their allegiances. Mm-hmm. So people are like cheering on different. People are enjoying it as a horror movie, but they're also cheering on. When it appeared that Freddy is winning, or when it appears that Jason is winning, you get different crowds cheering for it. I mean, that's the type of thing that you get at rep screenings all the time, at midnight screenings. It really is a one-of-a-kind experience, though, to see a movie with and to be in sync with a crowd that is enjoying it as much as you are.
Yeah, you mentioned horror movies, but I think possibly the most memorable movie-going experience of my life was at the Music Box in Chicago, which we talked about earlier. I was seeing the movie Roar, which is actually coming back to theaters now in the wake of Tiger King, but it is this really bizarre oddity that came out in the early 70s. It was one of the producers, I forgive me, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was married to Tippi Hedren, and they loved big cats and had hundreds of them on their just this land out in rural California, and they decided to shoot a movie with all their cats. It's called Roar. It is incredibly chaotic. Melanie Griffith got mauled on camera by a lion, and it made it into the movie because the poor woman, she was a girl at the time, these were her parents. She had no choice but to live on this place and be in this movie. And a lot of the movie is just the family trying to run away from the cats while dad is bounding around and just saying, isn't this great? They love me. And it's like, they're gonna kill you, dude. Noel Marshall is the guy's name. And so, yeah, he basically spent all the money he made executive producing The Exorcist on tigers and lions and cheetahs and leopards. And they made this movie called Roar. And when you're watching it, it almost feels like you're watching a snuff movie because these are real lions and tigers and wild cats. And these are real children. And they are really chasing the children around. And that was a very memorable theater experience because I remember looking over at the people next to me and being like, it felt illicit, you know? It felt like we were going to get arrested on our way out of the theater. And people were gasping and screaming involuntarily because they were genuinely afraid they were going to watch somebody get murdered on screen. And yeah, that would not have been the same at home at all. There was just something like conspiratorial about it that was really fun.
Well, and I think you're hitting on what can be so much fun about, and not just fun, what can be so emotionally satisfying about watching a movie with a crowd. Mm-hmm. And I think it is about, there's almost a communion that can happen sometimes between everybody in a movie theater. And it happens a lot with horror movies where people are kind of feeding off of each other's fear. I have distinct memories of seeing Paranormal Activity, the first one, in theaters, and just loving the way that you could sort of feel these shudders of unease pass through in waves across the audience, because so much of that movie is, you know, it's a found footage horror film, and every night the characters go to bed and they have a camera set up, a surveillance camera set up that gives a view of the room. And I think it actually works on audiences in a kind of sophisticated way, because I think it sort of trains audiences very quickly to formally understand the parameters of this room and to understand the parameters of the game. It's like, okay, so the shot is never going to change, but you know that every night it's going to escalate a little bit.
Right.
And a lot of it is about scanning the frame and waiting to notice the first thing that's wrong in the frame, the first sign of the Paranormal Activity. And when I saw that in theaters, I remember you could sort of tell different pockets of the theater noticing the thing that was off at different times.
Oh, that's really fun.
It was so much fun. And it was just like a wave that was going through the theater. Yeah. I'll never forget that. You know?
Yeah, another, when you were talking about kind of playing with form and expectations, that reminded me of, I feel really lucky because it didn't stay in theaters very long, but I saw Grindhouse on opening night as a double feature, and that was a really, really fun room. Everybody was having so much fun with the missing reel gag and all of that stuff, and people were just whooping and hollering, and we all kind of felt like we were watching something that was special, you know?
Yeah, for sure. And it doesn't always have to be fun either. It can be, you can be sort of, probably my most memorable movie theater experience of all time was Saving Private Ryan. In 1998. I went with my dad to see it. I remember my dad had a whole conversation with my mom because my mom was concerned about the violence. And my dad was like, I think he can handle it. And I mean, at that point, I had been allowed to see movies that I should not have been allowed to see. I was 14 and I had seen, I think at that point I had seen Cannibal Holocaust. My dad was right in assuming that I could handle
That's wild. Yeah, Saving Private Ryan is nothing.
It's nothing compared to that. But it is a visceral experience, and the theater, you could feel the gravity of the film resting on everybody in that theater. And I will never forget, there's one thing that happened in that theater that I will never forget, which is the scene where one of the grunts, I won't say which one in case you've not seen the film, basically takes a bullet and is dying, and he's like crying for his mother, and this woman behind me just bursts into tears and is basically is like quietly crying through the rest of the entire movie. And I remember finding that, because if you go to the movies a lot, people cry in movies, but this felt, in some way, maybe it was just the context of the movie we were watching. This felt like she was having a profound experience, and we were all sharing it. in a way.
Yeah. Well, something sort of like that happened to me rather recently, actually. Last fall, I went to like an advanced screening of Portrait of a Lady on Fire through the Chicago Film Festival. And, if you've seen that film, it really builds and builds. And then the final sequence is just incredibly emotional. And I sat and cried all the way through the end credits. And so did the guy next to me. And we just, at the end, we kind of like patted each other on the back because we had a moment together. We both sat and wept all the way through the end credits of the movie.
And that's what the movie theater experience can provide you. It really can provide you under the best circumstances with a communal experience.
Mm-hmm. And, like you mentioned religion, but it's not that far off, really, because people don't go to church and have that kind of communal experience the way they used to. And I think in some cases, film and pop culture does end up filling that sort of need that we have to experience things together.
Yep.
So yeah, Dowd, we're talking about, movie theaters as a communal experience and in some ways as a secular church. Is there a moment in film history that you look back and you wish, oh man, I really wish I had been there to experience that with a crowd?
Well, I'll say, first of all, there's countless moments. I mean, when somebody asks, like, what would you do if you had a time machine? My very nerdy, boring answer is that I would go back in time and see iconic movies with crowds on opening weekend. I think it would be like, if you pick the right movies, it would be like that Endgame scene over and over again. Mm-hmm. The one that really sticks out for me actually is Psycho. Mm-hmm. And I think a big part of that is that I really do believe that what happens about a half an hour into that movie, I mean, it's not just like one of the most iconic scares in the history of cinema. It's also, I think, one of the most radical moments in a Hollywood movie ever to do what that movie does in terms of, I'm tiptoeing around a movie that's from 1960, but to basically set something up, to set up our relationship to the story via a particular character, and then to then say half an hour into the film, like, what the movie you thought you were watching, that's not this movie. I would love to see an audience.
Well, it's funny you brought up Psycho, Alex, because there is a movie experience that you had in real life that I am incredibly jealous of.
Oh, do tell.
Another film that pulls a big surprise on the audience. I'm so mad that you were at the world premiere of Hereditary and I wasn't, and you were one of the first people who got to know about the big surprise in Hereditary before me.
And it's such a Psycho moment, too. I mean, it really is. It's one of the more, in terms of a film that is tied to the lineage of that classic, I think that it pulls that off better than almost anything I've seen since.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole other discussion to be had about that and how the film's marketing helped preserve the surprise and things like that. But I mean, that's one that definitely, if I could have tagged along in your suitcase, I would have.
I wish you could have.
But well, you didn't know. That was part of what was so cool about it. You didn't know it was going to be this big moment till it happened. But in terms of a communal collective experience, I think actually, if I could only get into a time machine and go back and see one, I would think I would like to go see the original 1977 Star Wars in a theater. I've heard stories from my parents, from other people's parents, from people, and they do describe it as kind of a life-changing movie experience.
I think people had never seen anything like that before, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
And which I attribute its singularity, even though that's a film that is obviously riffing on a number of influences. There's a whole bunch of other old Saturday morning serials and Kurosawa films. There's a whole bunch of stuff in this stew of that movie's DNA, one might say. Mm-hmm. But it combined them in a way that felt radically new to people at the time. I say this, of course, having grown up in a world where Star Wars already existed.
Yeah.
I mean, I was born in '84, and that, by then the original trilogy had all come out. But even as a kid, I could still feel the aftershocks of people's experience with Star Wars.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's one of those ground floor kind of things that you can say that you were there like the day that movies changed forever. All right, everybody, that's all we've got for you this week on Film Club. Please be sure to check out our bonus supplemental interview episode this week. We're talking to Ryan Ostrike, who's the general manager of the Music Box Theater. And while you're at it, please rate, review, and subscribe to Film Club on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
This week's episode of Film Club was hosted by me, Alex Dowd, and by Katie Rife. It was produced by Carl Blumberg, edited by Melissa Lorenz. Our sound mixer and finishing editor is Seth Hafer, and our motion graphics designer is Julie Mullins. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week with a new episode.